No, on Zoom. I'll do it in just one sec.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Bell, President and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Today, we're discussing a topic no one can seem to avoid right now, and with good reason. Artificial intelligence, once the stuff of science fiction, is now a reality all around us. We are already seeing the way it's changing society, and there's a pressing need to discuss the risks and benefits in great detail. For 80 years, the Bulletin has covered a variety of existential risks facing our planet. Beyond our consistent coverage of nuclear risks, biosecurity, and climate change, we're already increasing our focus on disruptive technology with a particular focus on artificial intelligence. Over the coming months, you'll see more coverage of AI through a series of articles and events that are funded by a generous grant from the Future of Life Institute. We thank them for the support that's allowing us to expand our efforts on these critical discussions on disruptive technologies. For today, we're absolutely honored to be joined by a diverse and absolutely expert group of experts to examine how AI is affecting security, privacy, and ultimately the very definition of truth. First, we're joined by Secretary Michael Chertoff. As many of you may know, he served as the second United States Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. He has a long and distinguished legal career, beginning with his service as a federal prosecutor in New York, and he is currently the co-founder and executive chairman of the Chertoff Group. Next, we have Melanie Mitchell. Melanie is a professor at the Santa Fe Institute and also a member of the Bulletin's Science and Security Board. She focuses on artificial intelligence, cognitive science, and complex systems. 2019, well ahead of the curve, she published a book on the topic called Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Humans. Next, we have Suresh Venkatasubramanian. Suresh is a professor of data science and computer science at Brown University. He recently served as the Assistant Director for Science and Justice in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. In that capacity, he helped co-author the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Thank you to all the guests for being here today. To those watching, you can use the chat function to ask your questions. We'll be monitoring and we'll leave them for later in the conversation. So let's start with some framing and understanding of where we are today. Melanie, since the public launch of ChatGPT in 2022, the integration of it and other large language models into our lives has been fast and somewhat complicated. So why has the public been so quick to embrace large language models or LLMs? And are there downsides to this embrace?
Well, we've never seen it before in AI systems that can communicate with us in very fluent language that sound very human-like and in fact use first-person pronouns. They say things like, I think, I believe, I see, and they are very convincing as intelligent entities. And I think that's just been captivating to the public. People, including all of us, are very responsive to any entity that will communicate with us in language. And even since the beginning of the field of AI back in the 1950s, we've had chatbots, much worse, of course, than the ones we have now. But even then, people have been struck by the illusion of personhood in chatbots. It also seems that systems like ChatGPT can answer any question very confidently, kind of like the computer back in the old Star Trek TV show that was able to answer anything and was always right. So it just seems like this is an incredible tool. Of course, the downside is that it's not always right, and it can be very manipulative to people who use it. Right now, I think most common use of these systems is as a companion or a conversation partner, or even as a therapist, or people talk about AI boyfriends and girlfriends.
Mm.
It's very, very supportive of the user. It's very enthusiastic about everything they say, and that can actually have a big downside.
Okay, we'll get into some of the particulars on that later. But Secretary Chertoff, you've had a long history in law and government. You've worked on a wide variety of practice areas, including crime and national security. Now you're heavily focused on AI. Why?
Well, I mean, I think AI has profound implications, both for the way our legal system operates and more generally the way our security, and including our national security, operates. There was a story in the news a year or so ago about lawyers who used AI to draft briefs. And the briefs read very persuasively. The problem is the cases were made up by the artificial intelligence, and the judges were not happy about that. But that's going to get corrected over time. And there are going to be some positive issues. There'll be the ability to use AI to do some of the nitty-gritty work that's now being outsourced to junior lawyers, so they won't have to do boring reviews of paper. It'll be done by AI. But there are also concerns about whether people are willing to believe the evidence. When I was a young prosecutor, many of my cases involved electronic surveillance, and that was video and audio. And even then, you had to demonstrate to the court that this was genuine, complete, and not altered. But now, with very persuasive video and audio imagery, it may be harder to get proof that it hasn't been altered. And alternatively, even when there's genuine evidence, lawyers may defend by saying, oh no, this is artificial intelligence. So it really challenges our trust in the legal system and in the evidence, and that has profound implications. And more generally, when we talk about national security and law enforcement, again, there are some positives, but also some negatives. On the positive side, AI can be a way of sifting through large amounts of intelligence to discern patterns, for example, of drug smuggling that wouldn't be evident to a human being, but will tell you that you need to deploy your resources in a certain way. On the other hand, in the negative, AI could be used as a tool to invade your cybersecurity by finding out ways to pretend to be you, or finding out ways to figure out what your passwords are, and then using that as a way of breaching the security of your cyberspace. So like anything else, AI is going to be both a benefit and a risk to our legal and our security systems.
Thanks for that outline. Suresh, you recently wrote a great piece for the Bulletin. Also did a live interview for us. We'll put that in the chat. But before we dive in on that article, could you reflect sort of where we are on the AI timeline in terms of development to sort of future applications, and why you think it's important to debate the pros and cons of AI right now, as opposed to just waiting to the future when it's at some more complete state?
So it's kind of surreal, and I think it's probably even more surreal for people like Melanie, who've been in this space for a long time and have looked at the AI development over a long time, that those who've been working in AI have seen sort of the slow deployments and improvements. And I would say that in the world I live in, when we think about AI and decision making in society, it's been deployed out in the world and affecting people's lives for over 10 years or more in many ways. So it's kind of weird to see 2022 being this kind of singular moment of singularity when everyone started paying attention, as if nothing had happened before. I was teaching a class last semester, and it was on the history of AI, and one student in their feedback was like, I didn't think AI existed before 2022, so I'm confused why we have this class. And now I've learned that there is more to AI than 2022. So on the one hand, the public has suddenly, for all the reasons mentioned, has suddenly become very aware and acutely aware of where AI development is and what these tools can do. But there's also a sense that it's been going on for a lot longer than people think it is. So I think having to sort of navigate both the sense that, oh, it's all brand new, and in fact it's not brand new, and the concerns are new, but in fact they're not new, is one of the challenges that we have to talk about right now. And as far as the pros and cons, I think it's also complicated because there are some topics where the discussion of pros or cons are extremely speculative, and it's really hard to have a grounded conversation that isn't faith-based in those topics. But there are other parts of the AI discussion that are very grounded with a lot of evidence where we can have the discussion. And I find that there's a lot of confusion and slippage between, wait, are we talking about the speculative stuff or are we talking about the real stuff? And when you ask this question of should we debate the pros and cons, of course we should, but depending on the topic, depending on the particular form of AI we're talking about.
So let's talk about a specific aspect of what we need to debate, and that's how data is powering AI, the types of ownership, the legality of all, how it works in the aspect of what is true, what is not true. So I know you have concerns, Suresh, about who's controlling the data that is becoming accessible. So can you talk a little bit about those concerns, and are there paths to better transparency in terms of accessible data?
Yeah, I go back and forth on my level of optimism or pessimism on this topic. But I think on the issue itself, let's try to understand, how things look, right? We've had kind of a vibrant economy in collection and trade of data for surveillance for a long time, right? What AI has done, I think, is sort of turbocharged that marketplace because there's so much more, as Secretary Chowdhury mentioned, there are many things you can do with this data now using AI. So it's expanded the possibility and the potential value, and therefore the marketplace for collecting and use of this data and the trade of data. Just yesterday, there was this big article by Reveal News and Lighthouse about how one of these more obscure protocols in cell phone systems, the SS7 protocol, can be used, and it's been known for it can be used to surveil people in various ways. So there's always been an interest in the collection of data. AI has turbocharged this, which makes it very hard to know how to staunch the flow in some sense. I think there are a lot of people who argue that you cannot do anything about the use and misuse of AI till you focus on data protection issues. I mean, the whole data protection layer that GDPR brought in, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, and that have been, people in the US have been trying to bring in for a long time. People have argued this is the first step, you have to do this. There are others who've argued that, that politically we don't seem to see that as a reality, but let's focus on AI and governance of AI in the absence of that. I think we all agree that you need to have regulations on transparency, access to data. I think it's even much more than transparency. Transparency is like the table stakes here. You need to be able to have controls over who gets access to data and how they use it and how it's transmitted. And we're nowhere near close to be able to do that right now.
So, Mr. Secretary, I know you spent a lot of time looking into the legality of who owns data, how it's shared. Can you talk about public and private data, the difference between the two, and the pros and cons of who is accessing it?
Well, public data is generally regarded as accessible by anybody. It's what happens out in the open. From a legal standpoint, public data usually does not get a lot of protection. Now, I will say one thing that has changed with AI is the ability to make use of such enormous quantities of public data that in a way it reveals things about people that they would never imagine would be revealed to somebody else. Because we generate all kinds of data all the time that is public, where we go, what we order to eat in a restaurant, that with AI can all be absorbed and combined to give a very, very detailed picture of what we do. And that can itself be intrusive in terms of making us feel constrained. Now, private data is obviously more obviously a protected class of data. And the question then becomes, to what extent is AI able to access that? Is it sometimes because of sloppiness on the part of the person whose data it is? Or is it based on some other algorithm that allows inferences about private data? And another issue that we're dealing with more and more now is whether copyright is something that is a barrier to AI accumulating learning, which is how you build a large language model. And remember, when you're dealing with an LLM, you're not dealing with a machine learning programmed in by detail, but literally you're cutting loose the AI to teach itself. And that means it's not going to feel constrained. Now, normally we view copyright as not a limitless barrier. In other words, if I read a book, I can't copy the book and put it out under my own name, but I can learn something from the book and use what I learned for my own purposes. The question again is going to be whether that balance of what the protection of copyright is will change as AI demonstrates that the use cases and the potential profitability of making use and exploiting copyrighted work has now become much more tipped in favor of AI.
I was wondering if I could jump in very briefly on
Yeah,
a
Suresh,
point.
please go ahead.
I mean, one thing that I constantly have to struggle with, I think, is how the introduction of AI has disrupted our very concept of how we've ordered the world and how we've ordered society. And I think this public-private distinction is a very good example of this, because you're absolutely right to say that there's, the notion of public data where, like, it's public data, so we can do what we want, and there's private data. The problem with AI, and I think with what I would consider kind of the compromise of the social contract that we have with the systems we interact with, like social media, is that if Facebook had started off by saying, hey, post on Facebook, we're going to take all this data and use it to market to you and sell it to the government so they can surveil you, I suspect they'd have had fewer customers than they have now. What they said was, hey, come to Facebook, you can connect with your friends and family and you can interact with them. And this is a good way to stay connected in an increasingly online world. And I'm like, great, that's good. I want to connect with my friends and family in an increasingly online world. There was an implicit social contract, like if not a formal one, an implicit sense of you can use these tools to connect with your friends without the unstated, and we're going to surveil you like heck because of you giving us all this data. And I think while it is technically correct that once we put data out there in public, we should not expect that we have any sense of privacy. But that's not what we as individuals understand. I mean, if you go do media training and if you go work in government, people tell you these things. But I think it's unfair to expect the average person who just wants to connect with friends and family to have to now think about, 10 years from now, someone's going to take that post I made on Facebook and use that to assess my level of anti-Semitism and deny me a position because of what I said then. That is not fair. And that goes to the heart of how we think about data as either private or public, which I think AI has compromised. We cannot think of it that way. A second point is that our statements, the things we say could affect people around us, right? They could affect our friends, our family, because of associative sort of guilt, if you wish. That, again, is not something we think about. We think of data as individualized and personal. But that's what AI does. It sort of spreads the blame and the suspicion across groups in various ways. We need better conceptions of what it means to protect ourselves in that world, and current language around privacy doesn't do that.
No, thanks for that. And apparently people aren't familiar enough with the Washington phrase, dance like no one's watching and email like it's going to be read in a legal deposition. So talking about, the uses of data, Melanie, let's dig in on how AI is using data to determine truth in its answers. You talked about this already. It says it with confidence. There's almost a sort of expectation that these LLMs are correct in what they're saying. But considering how much it can get wrong, the concept of hallucinations, and please explain what an AI hallucination is. How can we ensure that these tools are telling the truth? Are there systems, are there mechanisms that we can put into place that would responsibly express uncertainty rather, or refuse rather than produce a misleading answer?
You've jumped to a core open question at the heart of a lot of AI research: how to make sure that these models are honest, are truthful. And the answer is nobody knows how to do that yet. We see that these models are trained on vast amounts of human-generated text. Basically everything that's ever been digitized that big companies can get their hands on. And what they learn is not truth or falsity, but rather they learn the statistics and patterns of human language, how words go together, sort of what word plausibly follows a block of text. So they don't know what's true and what's not true the way humans do, but truth is rather a statistical property. If I ask ChatGPT, what's the capital of France? Statistically, the most probable answer is Paris, just by all the training data it's had. And so that it will tell you. So most of the time, it will tell you something that's true because statistically, that's the way that the training data works. But very often, as I'm sure everybody who's used ChatGPT has seen, it will produce something that's plausible but not actually true. So one example was, there was a case where the Chicago Sun-Times had a summer reading list of books, and the reporter putting it together used ChatGPT to help write the article. And it turned out that half the books on this list sounded very plausible, but actually didn't exist. They were by real authors, and they sounded like books those authors might have written, but they didn't exist because the model didn't know what books existed and which didn't, but it was generating the most plausible things. Now, we have this more recent system where these models can actually go out on the internet and look up things. So if I ask, what's the capital of France? It might go out on the internet and search for a web page that gives the answer and then give that link to me as a source for the answer it generates. That's called retrieval augmented generation. And that improves the truthness of what the models return, but there still can be hallucinations, or the models can misinterpret the source and give you an answer that is actually false because it didn't understand, for instance, that the source that it found on the web was a satirical article or something like that. And that's happened many, many times.
Can you explain for our audience, what is an AI hallucination? I think this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it's sort of hard to understand. What does that mean for a machine to hallucinate?
Right. So it means, I think the way people use the term is it means that it generates an answer or response that is false. That's simply, or that doesn't, it purports that something exists that doesn't really exist. Like I think Secretary Chertoff talked about legal briefs in which some case that was discussed didn't actually exist. That's a hallucination. But in some sense, you could say that everything a chatbot generates is a hallucination. Just most of the things happen to be true. There's no real difference between the true things and the false things in terms of the mechanism it uses to generate it. But it's just that statistically, most of the things that it generates will be true. But that still leaves it as being untrustworthy to be true in all cases.
Yeah. And you could, extrapolate from that, the untrustworthiness of these systems can have security implications. And that's really how the Bulletin has come to focus on this as an issue that could present, dangerous effects, if not existential risks. So Secretary Chertoff, we're already seeing large multimodal models, which can process text, images, audio, video simultaneously. With all of this information available and AI, able to create media that's extremely convincing, how concerned are you that we're prepared for, the mass use of deepfakes, of disinformation campaigns using AI as the tool?
Well, I mean, I think there is an increasing concern about AI as a tool of disinformation campaigns. We've seen that for years. As AI gets more sophisticated, we're going to see more of it. And of course, deep fakes, which are video or audio images of real people that are completely made up, will seem to be persuasive. And I think there was a story just the other day of a candidate for a public office in Virginia having an AI deep fake version of their opponent as a debating correspondent. I don't know whether that was disclosed to the audience or not, but you can see where that would be potentially very harmful to the person who's being imitated. And I think that's going to be an increasing problem. Now, there should be a requirement that anytime you masquerade as a real person with a deep fake, you must disclose the fact that it's not real. Whether that's enforceable or not is going to be a harder question. But there's a flip side too. Because not only is there the risk that deep fakes will fool us into thinking some real person said something they didn't say, but it also may be used by a real person to create mistrust about something that they did do. So if somebody in real life committed a crime and there's a video of that, and they're running for office and they say, that's a deep fake, it never happened, there may be a lot of people who are going to agree with that, in which case you still have a falsehood that's being propagated. It's just a different kind of falsehood. So, I mean, what the risk to me in terms of our social cohesion and our electoral process is that the concept of trust becomes malleable. And without trust, you cannot have a unity of effort, and it's very hard to have a functioning society. If everybody winds up believing, contrary to what Daniel Moynihan said, that you're entitled to your own opinion and you're entitled to your own facts, then we're going to have some serious problems of governance going forward.
Hmm. No, I thank you for that, and thank you for noting, this new development of the Republican candidate for the lieutenant governor's race in Virginia. He was the one that had this AI debate with his opponent, who declined to a live debate. He dubbed it the debate that should have happened. So I guess the question to all three of you is: should that have happened? Should he have used an AI image of his opponent in that way?
Yeah, let me just chime in and say, I mean, I respect satire, and I understand that there's a long tradition of being satirical, as long as you're disclosing that it's satire and that it's not true. So, I mean, it doesn't bother me that you would have an image, as long as you were very clear this is not real. It's just a satire or an image.
Suresh?
I know. I feel like we live in a post-shame world, so it's very hard to shame people for doing this. I would have loved to, I think people should do what they want in a political campaign, but you should be able to shame them for doing it, and there should be a lot of shame for doing this kind of debate, even if someone's going to do it. I don't think you should find some rule saying you cannot run a debate with an AI-generated candidate, but I think Secretary Chertoff is exactly right to say you have to be able to disclose this, otherwise you have nothing to go on anyway. I think this is all, it's comical if it's not sad. I think, after the No Kings protests, or during the No Kings protests, the president put out a video that I will not describe, that I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. And then, of course, later on is like, oh, it was just a joke. So even the problem of, satire is good, yes, maybe, but everyone can dismiss anything they do by saying it's a joke, but letting the message hang out there kind of in the air. We do have a problem, I think. And I don't know. I don't know what to do about this. I do not want to tell politicians, you cannot do this. I think that's also wrong. I think we need norms, and we need better expectations. And I think living in a post-norms, post-shame world, it's kind of hard to imagine what those would look like.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And doing a negative thing and saying, oh, it was a joke, doesn't actually negate the negativity of the thing. Melanie, what's your take on this?
So I think that disclosure is maybe the least possible thing you can do. But even if you disclose it that this is a fake, people will still be influenced by it. There was a case recently where there was a court case where the dead victim was sort of resurrected, if you will, as an AI deep fake, and testified in the case. And everybody was told this was AI, that it was fake, that it was, but it was very influential to the jury in awarding damages. And I think that's a dangerous thing. There's an article by the late philosopher Dan Dennett in The Atlantic called "The Problem with Counterfeit People" that I think everybody should read. Everybody in this audience, everybody who's making policy, everybody who's thinking about AI. And Dennett, who has long worked in sort of philosophy of mind, said that the counterfeit people created by AI, either whether they're like fake, not real people, not meant to represent real people at all, or meant to represent an actual person, he said they are the most dangerous artifacts in human history. That's a pretty big statement given the kinds of artifacts that humans have created, that these are the most dangerous artifacts because they will erode, as Secretary Chertoff said, they will erode all notions of trust. And I think that it's really something we have to think very hard about how we should regulate, how we should legislate, how we should develop norms for this kind of thing, because it's here.
There's
Yeah, Suresh, I definitely come in on that. I also wanted to point out that in your bulletin article, you equated AI similarly to nuclear energy, in that it is useful, but it requires a lot of guidelines to be safe. So could you talk about, how you might apply lessons learned from other technologies to better control of AI?
That's a big question. I think, and the reason I gave that analogy is also because so in a separate conversation, I was asked to talk about sort of these friend necklaces that this company has been pushing out as a kind of a gimmick, sort of as a device, and it sort of was reminding me of the time when radium necklaces were actually a thing. You could get a necklace which would glow green. It was supposed to be cool before people realized that radium is radioactive and you will get cancer and die. And maybe we shouldn't be using radium as an ornament, even though it's useful for in other applications. There are many analogies around how to think about AI. Nuclear energy, I think, is one of them, but there are others too. I think it's just we're trying to make sense of what is a very disruptive new technology using metaphors from the past to try and understand where we can. I think the nuclear energy metaphor is helpful, if only to try to get away from AI is good, AI is bad, to the point of no, it's a piece of technology. We have to decide how we want to put rules around it. We have to understand that it has harmful effects and could potentially have some useful effects if we think carefully about it. But it's not in and of itself a moral agent of being good or bad. It's a set of tools that reflect, and how we use it reflects how we want to sort of operate in the world. And that's, I think, the point I wanted to make about that. The other comment I want to make, sort of relating to the idea of counterfeit people and Dan Dennett's article, right? There is a sort of a growing both movement within the world of sort of social experimentation to say, hey, it's hard to get people to opine on a topic. Let's get a bunch of AI bots to act like people and have them opine on this topic because it's cheaper, it's more efficient. We can customize the personas to be, here is the ACLU representative, or here is the stay-at-home dad, and here's what they would represent. And there's been questions from cognitive psychologists. I just read an article saying, is this going to give us what we want? The short answer is probably not. But again, this idea of counterfeit people and using AI bots in various forms, either text-based or otherwise, to replace how people think is dangerous for all these reasons. And Melanie, your point about disclosure being the minimum, right? I mean, you mentioned the chatbots from the 60s and Eliza. Everyone who talked to Eliza knew it was a chatbot. There was no illusion that it was not a computer. And yet, people felt comfortable exposing their deepest secrets to it, to the point of telling other people. I remember Joseph Weizenbaum saying his secretary told him to leave the room when she was talking to Eliza because she had private things to say to Eliza, even though it was very clear it was disclosed as an AI bot. So as humans, we tend to do this a lot, regardless of what we're told about the thing we're talking to.
So let's shift a little further into possible solution sets. And Secretary Chertoff, I'm glad we have you here and not your AI bot. Some of the proposals, to control AI, range from absolutely strict bans on use entirely across sectors. Some and a lot in private industry propose a lighter touch on the framework. So where on the spectrum do you place yourself? And how do we connect the poles of the argument here that AI is going to kill us all, or no, AI is our best friend and it will solve all our problems?
Well, I think like anything else that's technological, there are upsides and downsides. And I've come up with a kind of a simple way to say we ought to install or require the 3Ds. The 3Ds are data, disclosure, and decision making. So what do I mean by that? Data means there ought to be requirements to make sure that the data you are unleashing your AI on for purposes of learning is not private or secret, that it is accurate, and that it's not prejudiced or biased. Disclosure is when you use AI to do something public. You should have to disclose, I used AI for this, whether it's writing an article or writing a brief or some kind of a performance, just to give people a heads up. And that, of course, would answer the issue of deep fakes. And finally, on decision making, when you're actually making a decision that will materially affect the well-being of a human being should be in the loop. So I would not, for example, there's a lot of discussion about using AI for drones. But if you're going to use drones to strike at targets with missiles, the decision to pull the trigger should not be left in the hands of AI. Although AI might generate data that would be useful to the decision maker, in the end, a human being has to have the thumbs up or thumbs down. So in a kind of a brief way, those would be the three principles I would impose on the use of AI as we go forward.
Thanks for that. And thanks for sort of outlining norms and behaviors. And we're really at the start of the conversation, I think, government to government. Suresh, you did work on this in the the DC term, in the government, and mentioned earlier the AI Bill of Rights. Can you talk a little bit about that? I worked on the political declaration on the responsible military uses of artificial intelligence. This was just the beginning, not legally binding measures, but again, norms and behaviors. Was that a good start? Are we moving fast enough? And where do you think the Trump administration is going to go in terms of this conversation about regulation?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm glad Secretary Chertoff mentioned the 3Ds, because those are in some ways 3 of the 5 components of the AI Bill of Rights, right? So the whole point of the AI Bill of Rights was to articulate protections that people should have as we move towards a more algorithmically mediated sort of world, whether we like that or not, right? And just drawing on the years of knowledge of what happens when these systems are actually deployed. And again, I want to emphasize, AI systems have been deployed, depending on how you define the term, for many years prior to the ChatGPT release. And so we have a lot of evidence, actual evidence of what happens when deployments go right and when they go wrong. And so the Bill of Rights was trying to codify, principles that should govern any kind of, use of automated decision systems. And there were 5 of them, right? So there were the 3 that Secretary Chowdhury mentioned, like data protection and data, governance of data, the idea of transparency and disclosure, right? The right to an explanation as to how decisions are being made. And also the idea of human in the loop, that there should always be a person who can intercede and has power to intercede, not just the thumbprint at the end, but the power to intercede and maybe override as needed. But in addition to that, and it's almost surprising that I have to say this, is that we have to make sure these systems even work in the first place. A lot of systems that are put out there make all kinds of grand claims of quality and accuracy that are not borne out at all and have no evidence for being true. I mean, it's literally like putting drugs out there saying, yeah, they might work, you should take them, whatever, at your own risk. We told you they might not work, so it's your fault if you take them and die, right? That's the kind of level we are at with AI tools right now. There is no attempt to verify that a tool that's put out there that affects people's lives in some material way, as Secretary Chertoff said, actually do what they're supposed to do. So the very first principle in the Bill of Rights, like, they should be safe and effective, to use the language from the FDA, right? They should not harm you, and they should do what they claim to do. And the second part of that, and an equally important part, they should not amplify biases, because we know that AI draws on historical data, because we know that the history of this country is drenched with all kinds of biases and racism and sexism and so many other discrimination. We know these tools left to their own devices will amplify these biases. And so we have to correct for that as well, as just another example of make sure they actually work. And so those things, together with the 3 things that Secretary Chowdhury mentioned, are the core of the Bill of Rights. And I think it was a very good framework for how the Biden administration was talking about AI, whether it's through the executive order, the national security memo, and also how states have started to sort of talk about their regulation of AI across the country, over thousands of bills being proposed. There's a lot of that idea and those thinking that has gone into this bill as well. So I'm, on the one hand, I'm happy to see the effect of that. Of course, you mentioned the current administration, which has kind of gone 180 degrees in the opposite direction. And I think, in my personal view, has either an incoherent or a dangerous view on the topic of AI regulation.
So Melanie, how can political leaders and the public increase AI literacy? And in terms of governance, what's the approach? Top down, sector by sector, bottom up? Is it simply, creating laws around this, or is it more normative? What's your take on how we go forward?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Obviously people who work in policy making and education and maybe every every field really should have some kind of AI literacy. But what do we mean by AI literacy? How much do they need to know? And what happens when the field changes like it does seemingly every week? How do we keep up? Even those of us who are researchers in the field have a very hard time keeping up with what's happening latest and how the latest models work. Moreover, companies in some ways don't want us to have AI literacy in the sense that their models and the data they're trained on are not transparent. That knowing too much about how these models work might give their competitors an advantage, which they don't want. So I think the incentives go against transparency. They go against sort of the right kind of AI literacy that people really need. So I think that we have to really change some of those incentives. But I don't have a great answer to that question because it's, the notion of AI literacy is so ill-defined. But I can see that we need to come up with a set of sort of facts about AI or knowledge about AI that everyone should have.
Secretary Chernoff, your take on this? You've served inside. Is the U.S. government or governments around the world moving fast enough, and do they have the right experts inside to help work through these issues?
I think it's very challenging. I think, in the security area, they are focused on the use of AI, both as a threat and also as a response. And I say we see that with drones and things like that. Although I'm a little concerned that some of our adversaries may feel disinhibited in terms of using AI if they feel they get an advantage, even if it winds up transgressing the rules of conduct of warfare. I think more generally, right now there's a race between the US and China and maybe Europe to see who comes up with the most advances in AI. And I understand that that's true, but again, I think we need to be careful, as was said earlier, as we became with the nuclear era, to understand that these things have tremendous downside risk. And we need to build a deep understanding of what that risk is before we start to deploy this on a widespread way.
Now, we're about out of time. One of the questions I definitely want to ask you is for everyday people who are using AI, engaging with it on a semi-regular basis. What advice would you give to people in terms of how to protect themselves and the nature of the debate they need to be a part of? So, Suresh, let's start with you.
The thing I say all the time to people, and I have to answer this question many times, is that you play with the tools and trust your own instincts and knowledge. Don't be swayed by what you're being told you should think about AI. Build your own relationship with the tools and understand what they'll. I have found this to happen over and over again. People who have expertise in an area start to interact with a tool about that area and suddenly realize, oh, I see where it's hallucinating. I see where it's giving meh answers. I see where it's limited. That doesn't mean they stop using it, but it gives them a way more balanced understanding of it. And I think people should do more of that, trust themselves and their own knowledge when they interact with these systems.
Melanie?
Well, I'll say something that might seem a bit radical, but I don't think children should be able to use these tools. I think that the downside is much more down than the upside is up for kids. And this can be either with respect to, doing their homework or using these systems as friends or therapists. And we've seen some really tragic situations that have come out of that. And I don't think that children yet have the kind of critical thinking ability to understand what these systems are and how to use them in a safe way. So I would give my advice to parents that the children should not be using these systems.
Secretary Chertoff, your thoughts?
I think a healthy skepticism. I remember when I was a little child and television was relatively new, Wonder Bread used to have an ad where a kid ate a piece of Wonder Bread and then in 10 seconds grew into an adult. And they'd say Wonder Bread makes you grow in 12 different ways. And my mother said to me, no, it doesn't. If you see ads like that, just leave the room and get yourself an ice cream cone. And I think we've got to teach that skepticism with respect to data, particularly coming in over the internet. We have to teach people to kick the tires.
Excellent. That's a perfect note to end on. That's all the time we have today. Thank you again to the Future of Life Institute for supporting this conversation and others that we're having on AI. Our next virtual session will be on November 6th, where we will be looking at the new Netflix film, A House of Dynamite, which is a fictionalized look at a chain of command crisis as an ICBM is being launched towards Chicago. So check out that movie starting on Friday, then join us in November to discuss it. But register today so you don't forget. And if you want even more discussion of AI, you can join us for our annual dinner, Conversations Before Midnight. That'll take place on November 12th in Chicago. We'll be having conversations with Blaise Aguirre-Iarchis, a vice president and fellow at Google, and Jan Tallinn, founding engineer of Skype, and co-founder of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Future of Life Institute. So we'll include that in the chat. Hope to see you there. And as Secretary Chertoff suggests, maybe a good time to go get an ice cream. Thanks for joining us today.